Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Spotlight series. Today's discussion is with Chuck Todd and Mark Fairbanks. Mark is a Senior Managing Director with Foreside and is primarily responsible for the design, development, and creation of products and services that assist Foreside's distribution and broker-dealer clients. Chuck is also a Senior Managing Director and is responsible for administering Foreside's fund officer and compliance services for Foreside's clients. Chuck, Mark, welcome to the Foreside Spotlight Series.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
Yeah, same, John. Thank you.
Great. We're really looking forward to the discussion today. Obviously, the benefits of our series is that it really delivers a clear understanding about what we offer that one may not get with a standard presentation, and also delivers a really timely illustration within the industry about whatever the topic is, which today is the discussion around series trust. And I'm really looking forward to both of you sharing your message with our listeners. We'll get to the topic in a moment, but I really always prefer to start off on a bit of an individual or personal note. Both of you have had very interesting and unique backgrounds and careers, and I'm sure that the listeners would love to hear a bit about what you've done and how you've gotten to where you are today. So, Chuck, we'll start with you. Would you be able to give the listeners a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. Thanks, John. I think between Mark and myself, I'm the rookie of the duo here. Just coming up on my 13th year with Foreside. I joined the firm back in late 2018 from J.P. Morgan, where I managed the firm's financial reporting team with respect to external clients. So I think that positioned me really well for the move to Foreside, where I stepped in as the treasurer for one of our strategic clients. Served in that role for many years, and over the years took on additional responsibility within our fund officer unit. So my role today is really to be responsible for three main groups within the fund officer platform. That includes our outsourced treasurers, our fund CCOs, who usually also serve as anti-money laundering compliance officers for many of our clients as well as a small regulatory administration team.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Mark, how about you? I know you've had quite a long career here with Foreside. I'm sure the listeners would love to hear a bit about your background as well.
I have. Thanks, John. In fact, it'll be 25 years this fall, which includes my time at Foreside's legacy firm. My career at Foreside's legacy firm began with compliance, broker-dealer compliance, and when we became a standalone entity in late 2004, it was essentially me and the chief compliance officer that oversaw our single broker-dealer. As such, the ability to participate in all service aspects of an underwriter for registered funds and holding FINRA licenses for personnel who wholesale the fund to intermediaries and institutions was really invaluable. It permitted me the ability to really dive in and see all aspects of the underwriter and the broker-dealer. And because of that, I probably wouldn't be where I am today. And then, several years ago, I transitioned to the business side, and among other roles have served as the president of Foreside's 17 affiliated broker-dealers. And I think because of this sort of very varied history, I've been fortunate to witness and participate in Foreside's growth as a firm that really began with 4 employees and now has in the neighborhood of 300 employees.
Yeah, it's amazing the growth that the company has had, and congratulations, 25 years is amazing, especially in today's day and age. So kudos to you for that, and appreciate both of you jumping in today. So let's start with the big picture. I know there's a lot of questions around this topic, but Chuck, maybe we'll start with you. Let's start with the basic question of, what major options does a fund sponsor have to choose from in terms of a legal entity or structure when considering the launch of a registered fund?
Sure. Thanks, John. And I think it's hand in hand, really, the decision of the structure of the legal entity that a sponsor would launch really goes hand in hand with their distribution strategy and understanding who their audience is. So we serve, and I'll focus here really on registered funds that would be registered under the 1940 Act. So we serve here within my team as treasurers and fund CCOs and sometimes secretary to several structures, including closed-end funds, mutual funds, and exchange-traded funds, ETFs. Often what we'll see within those subcategories is that firms that have traditionally managed pools of assets that are a little more difficult to value might gravitate toward the closed-end fund, where they have potential options other than daily NAV valuation. Clients that might be focused on, say, retirement pools, certain 401k plans, for example, that might not yet offer full ability of employees to trade ETFs within their 401k account, they might gravitate toward mutual funds. And then, of course, we have a lot of interest lately, especially after the ETF rule lowered some of the barriers to entry in the space to launching ETFs. I think sometimes particularly among younger investors, ETF is almost used as shorthand for a fund. And the ability to have certainty immediately what your price is, both entry and exit, as well as some of the tax efficiency that goes along with those types of products, have certainly given them wide appeal. The last thing I'll just comment on, John, and something we hear from clients who maybe weren't as successful as they had hoped a couple of years after launch, is that they wish they were a little more focused on their distribution strategy. And when I say distribution, I really mean sales strategy, more so than the legal underwriting support that Foreside provides for so many of our clients. So having that clear-eyed strategy going into the launch, I think will save a lot of heartache later on down the road, since we're well beyond the phase of if we build it, they will come in terms of attracting assets.
And I would agree with that. Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry. I would agree with all of those aspects, and I think to add to that, we've seen many of the firms that come to Foreside that don't really have a lot of background in the 40 Act registered fund space. They may be private fund managers, or they may be managers of SMAs, and again, really are not accustomed to the highly regulated industry that we're in. So we're able to sit back and provide them with some information as to what they need to look at, which obviously includes the series trust or standalone structure. But in addition to that, they need to look at all of the service providers, because that will help them determine which path they wish to take. So as a registered product, certainly the investment advisor is coming to us. They probably play the key critical role as it relates to the fund success. But you have the fund counsel, you'll have the administrator, the transfer agent, the auditor, and of course the distributor and fund officers, which two services are core to Foreside. So I think with that aspect of coming in, as Chuck mentioned, the distribution strategy, sort of understanding the larger picture is really the first step.
Great, thanks for that. Great, thanks guys. That was very informative, and I agree with you. The distribution strategy and really figuring that out is super important. Obviously we get a lot of inquiries around, there's a lot of costs when it comes to launching a fund, especially a registered fund, because of the oversight and things that the sponsor needs to be aware of. Can you guys provide some highlights in terms of the specific costs that people need to be aware of as they're contemplating launching a new fund?
Sure, John. I can start. It's Chuck. I think one point I'd make is as you begin to select your service providers, and that's an item that Foreside is always happy to assist with. If we're your first call, you'll begin to receive some support from a number of folks during the process. So I know we'll jump in a little bit into more detail around the series trust model, but many of the administrators that support series trusts have a pro forma document that they can leverage and adjust a bit to suit your circumstances. And having Foreside as part of that conversation, particularly a Foreside treasurer, can be really helpful for firms who are looking to put a finer point on some of those costs. But just as an example, focusing on fund expenses, of course, the advisory fee is an important decision. With respect to ETFs, we're seeing many advisors opt for a unitary fee arrangement, which allows a very clean approach from a prospectus point of view, a little more certainty for investors and shareholders when they're looking to understand what their fees will be. And in those instances, the advisor is really absorbing all of the other expenses, with a few exceptions for extraordinary items. But having an understanding of those expenses is equally important, as to whether they'll be absorbed by the fund or by the advisor. An alternative to the unitary fee arrangement is a more traditional cap and waive arrangement. One of the reasons why the unitary fee presentation is a little cleaner in a prospectus is SEC requirements don't allow you to assume that your fee waiver will continue indefinitely. So there's a big kind of step up in the hypothetical expense disclosures in the prospectus for a cap and waive structure, whereas that's not required for a unitary fee arrangement. So just one consideration as you think about structure there. But in terms of other expenses beyond the advisory fee, certainly your administrator, your transfer agent to the extent relevant, your custodian, those are going to be material fees. You want to be thoughtful about board structure, understanding that most folks would like to have a minimum of 3 independents in order to have tiebreakers for any votes where that's important. There will also be the fund officers, as I've mentioned before, so the treasurer for the funds, the fund CCO and anti-money laundering compliance officer, the fund secretary. You'll also want to think as the fund grows about expenses like fulfillment or printing and mailing of shareholder reports. Thankfully, those are numbers that are tending to go downward thanks to growing popularity of e-delivery and growing acceptance within the SEC to allow for those shareholder reports and documents to be delivered to shareholders electronically. But those are a few I'd mention. The legal underwriter would typically be picked up by the advisor unless the fund includes a 12B1 plan. And maybe that's a good point to pass over to Mark for any additional thoughts around expenses.
It does. Thank you, Chuck. And certainly with expenses that we've highlighted here in these slides is that, there's a wide variety, and it really depends upon the product itself. Are there multiple share classes? What's the distribution strategy that we spoke about? Will there be multiple selling agreements? Are you looking at getting access to various platforms such as Schwab, Fidelity, Pershing that have their own embedded fees? So there's a lot of analysis that needs to go into that overall fee structure. But I think related to the topic here, one thing that oftentimes catches firms by surprise is that under SEC rules, the fund cannot pay for distribution expenses unless there's a 12B1 plan or something like that attached to the fund, and generally those fees would not be enough to sort of cover those expenses. So that relationship and that agreement ultimately resides between the distributor and the advisor.
And Mark, could you dig in a little bit on some of those expenses? Would that include things like fact sheets and other sales literature?
It would. So, for 12B1 fees that are related to distribution expenses, and again, this is really in the mutual fund space that we're speaking about. ETFs can have a 12B1 plan, but it's rare, and personally, I haven't seen any of those enacted. But in the mutual fund side, if there's a 12B1 plan in place, oftentimes those commissions, which generally are up to 25 basis points, are paid out to the selling dealer. So if you're working through a UBS, Merrill Lynch, LPL, then those commissions oftentimes go to those entities. But there will be money left over that can be applied to various distribution expenses that are tied to the fund's 12B1 plan. So Chuck, as you mentioned, yes, that could pay for a fact sheet. It could pay for the filing of marketing materials with FINRA. It could also pay for attendance by the advisor's personnel to a Morningstar or a Schwab conference or something along those lines. And then also could be paid to assist with like Schwab and Fidelity fees too.
And Mark, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought up intermediary fees, or some people refer to those as sub-TA fees. So I guess, when you and I were starting in this business, it was very common for mutual funds to have an extremely large shareholder base of direct investors. That's probably now typically a much smaller percentage of the overall shareholder base. Most folks are probably coming in through those intermediaries, and I suppose we've seen those fees really creep up over the years. So that can be a very material component of the total costs to an advisor, and depending on the fee structure, may actually be paid by the advisor, right? So, understanding what the fund will be able to pick up with respect to transfer agency or shareholder servicing fees or distribution fees is really important on the front end.
Absolutely, and it's extremely rare these days that funds will have direct shareholders. As you mentioned, they're typically going in through an intermediary, and if you're doing that, then there are fees for the privilege of being on that platform. I think too, for individuals that are looking to launch an ETF, there is a distinction, a very clear distinction between mutual funds and ETFs related to that process too, because as we all know, ETFs are exchange traded, so therefore the buying and selling is happening on an exchange, and the agreement process really is falling back to the authorized participant. So there are some cost savings with respect to that process of an ETF versus a mutual fund.
Yeah, it sounds like it's very in depth, and the highlights on these slides really give the sponsor a lot to consider when it's looking at the different buckets and areas. So as we move into the next slide, really the meat of what we're talking about today is, one of the big questions and probably the big major decision that somebody needs to make is whether or not to launch your own trust or to go into a series trust. It would be great if you guys could provide an overview on that next slide that gives an overview of the factors that they need to consider and what they should be thinking about when they evaluate their options.
Sure. Thanks, John. This is Mark speaking. And, Foreside, we have the luxury of being agnostic. For us, it doesn't matter, what path our clients take. And we work with administrators and other firms that sponsor their own series trusts, or will, help a firm on their standalone structure as well. So, for us, I think we're able to sit back and provide some sort of unbiased thoughts related to, what the client should look at as they go down that path. A general rule for a series trust versus standalone is cost, right? Typically the plug and play of the series trust is what appeals to asset managers who may be new to the registered fund world. So they're able to sort of come into this preset program, have others that are providing services already to that trust, and then move forward on a much quicker basis and a less costly basis. I think that structure works very, very well for an asset manager who maybe is an SMA manager, and they want to create a mutual fund wrapper to capture client assets that don't meet the SMA minimum. This could be for estate planning purposes, or perhaps there are family members tied to that advisor whose wealth doesn't permit them to invest in SMA, but they really want the ability to sort of keep those assets, within those families, and therefore a mutual fund is a really good strategy in order for that to happen, and in a series trust structure too, because again, you're seeking to keep costs low. And as we discussed earlier, the distribution strategy there is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Conversely, if you have a firm and perhaps are a larger asset manager, it may be a foreign asset manager that is seeking to enter the U.S. They want to make a big splash. They have a detailed and robust distribution strategy, which could include multiple share classes, a retail and institutional audience, and they have deep pockets. And those firms oftentimes will seek the standalone structure, really as a means of greater control related to the funds and the service providers, and also have some ability to choose board members. So for those firms, taking that path, then oftentimes a standalone is their preferred approach.
And Mark, I think you really did a nice job of highlighting some of those considerations. I would agree that most folks tend to think that the cost is a big one when opting for a series trust. And I think your comments kind of hinted also at speed to market, right? So understanding that the majority of the service provider agreements have already been negotiated at the trust level. So with certain exceptions, to accommodate for client-specific particulars, it is relatively plug and play. Mark, for a client that might be interested in a particular series trust where Foreside isn't already the legal underwriter, is there an opportunity for us to partner nonetheless?
Absolutely, and we do that with several firms. And again, it could be for a variety of reasons. It may be that the firm that they're looking at doesn't offer some of the same services that we do, so we can fit in. But yes, to the extent that you have a service provider and they're sort of all in one, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to use the underwriter tied to that service provider.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think another one I'd mention is control, right? So if you're joining a series trust, there's going to be an existing board, and of course there's a requirement for any trust, whether it's standalone or series trust, to have a majority of independent directors or trustees. But I think there is some ability when the sponsor is allowed to participate in that selection process to, have a little stronger hand in setting the tone and understanding kind of the culture of the board on the front end, rather than sort of stepping into an existing one. So that's a consideration. I'd also maybe mention brand. I think, Mark, you mentioned, some advisors might want to make a big splash, and if you're the type of asset manager that might be a little bit later to the registered product space, but you're very brand conscious, you have certainly more flexibility and ability to manage that through a standalone. But we work with some great sponsors of series trusts, and I think it truly is a personal decision for every fund sponsor to make. And it doesn't have to be a forever decision either. We've certainly seen some asset managers that have grown up in a series trust format and then ultimately made a decision to venture out on their own, and others that are very happy to stay there long term despite lots of success. So we see all types. We've certainly also seen ETF series trusts come about with some great growth and success, in addition to the more traditional mutual fund trusts. And even in the past 5 years or so, we've seen some mixes. So maybe a sponsor starts a mutual fund trust and wants to add ETFs and does it within the same trust. So that's a little bit more unique, but not impossible. Certainly talking to your service providers and your counsel about your options there is really important. And even with respect to closed-end funds, which traditionally are a standalone legal entity, so they're not sharing the trust, so to speak, sometimes have the opportunity to pool resources and perhaps share a board and common service provider contracts and find efficiency in that manner. So there's lots of different options, even within the series trust format.
Yeah, agreed. That was a great overview, guys. Really appreciate you diving in. I know there's always questions on that, and I think one of the big pieces of value that Foreside brings to the table is, we are, as you mentioned, independent. We don't really care necessarily as to what the direction the sponsor goes, but we can help guide them in either direction. So if you are interested in learning more about our services, all you have to do is reach out to our team. We would be more than willing to provide you guidance and counsel on what the best solution would be for your individual situation. As we mentioned, we have numerous series trust relationships where we can provide introduction and guidance, as well as we have a full suite of the in-house services from distributor to CCO to PFO and all of the different components that you'll need if you want to go it as a standalone. So either way, we're here to help, and we would really appreciate any questions that you may have for us. So I think that covers the topic for today. I'm sure the listeners will find this information very informative. If you do want to chat with us, my contact information is there. Just feel free to reach out, and we can jump on a call and begin the process. So Chuck, Mark, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. It was super informative, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you,
Thanks,
John.
Pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.